Welcome to the deep dive. We're taking you inside the U.S. Congress today, specifically looking at what was happening on one particular day, June 5th, 2025.
Exactly. And our source material is the Congressional Record itself. It's basically the official transcript, the raw feed of the debates, the votes, everything said on the floor that day.
Right. It's like a snapshot. And our job here is to, well, unpack some key pieces from that snapshot for you. We want to highlight what was debated, what got voted on, maybe some moments of recognition, and crucially, why it matters.
Yeah, we'll dig into some pretty heated debates, actually. Things like small business support clashing with government spending priorities, some significant talks on foreign policy and national security, too.
And even, those moments that connect Congress back to local communities, like tributes and recognitions.
Should be interesting.
Okay, let's dive right in. A big chunk of the day, June 5th, 2025, seems to have involved debate and votes on bills related to the Small Business Administration, the SBA.
That's right. The record shows a lot of energy around two SBA bills in particular. First one up was H.R. 2931. The title was Save SBA from Sanctuary Cities Act of 2025.
That title definitely signals the intent. So its stated purpose was what exactly?
It aimed to require the head of the SBA, the administrator, to actually move SBA offices out of places designated as sanctuary jurisdictions.
Okay. And the arguments for doing that, how did supporters frame it?
Well, they really leaned into the immigration policy angle and safety. The argument was essentially that these jurisdictions aren't following federal immigration law, creating unsafe conditions, and so relocating the offices was presented as a kind of necessary consequence.
So connecting it to border issues, maybe claims of increased crime or resource strain in those cities.
Precisely. And they argued it wasn't about cutting services entirely, just ensuring SBA employees' safety and moving those services somewhere else, somewhere compliant. You even had one supporter use the phrase, make Main Street safe again.
Right. And the counter arguments, what did opponents say?
They saw it very differently, basically as a political attack, punishing cities for their political stance on immigration, not really about the SBA's mission at all.
So hurting small businesses, wasting taxpayer money on relocations, disrupting services, that kind of thing.
Exactly. They said it was dragging a vital agency, the SBA, into a, quote, culture war and ignoring, the real economic challenges businesses face.
Were there specific examples mentioned, like potential impacts?
Yeah, there were. Concerns about closing the New York City office, for example. Opponents argue that office serves like hundreds of thousands of businesses, not just in the city, but in surrounding areas too, like Newark in New Jersey.
Okay, so a ripple effect.
Right. And they also pointed out that many businesses in these areas are in, vibrant, diverse communities, and they employ lots of people, including some undocumented workers who, they noted, pay taxes. So the feeling was the bill would end up harming the very people the SBA is supposed to help.
So a bill about where SBA offices should be located becomes this proxy fight over immigration, federal versus local control. Pretty intense. Now, you mentioned process. There was a motion to recommit on this bill from Mr. Cisneros of California. Can you explain what that is briefly?
Sure. A motion to recommit, it's usually one of the last procedural moves before a final vote, often used by the minority party as a final attempt to change or, derail a bill.
Okay. And in this case, it wasn't just to send it back, but with specific instructions.
That's key. The motion was to send H.R. 2931 back to committee, but with instructions for the SBA administrator to basically do a whole study before any relocation happened.
A study on what?
Really detailed stuff. They wanted to report on the number of businesses served by the office, the data driving the relocation decision, a solid plan for keeping services going, a timeline who would be impacted employee-wise, basically a demand to analyze the potential fallout and practicality first.
So trying to inject some data and planning before this potentially disruptive move, how did that motion do?
It failed. The record shows the vote was 201 in favor, 212 against, with 19 not voting. That's roll call known for 154.
Close, but no cigar. And then the final vote on the bill itself followed right after.
Yep, that's typically how it works. After the motion to recommit failed, they moved straight to the vote on passing H.R. 2931.
And the outcome?
The bill passed the House. The vote was 214 yeas, 198 nays, and 20 not voting. That was roll call number 155.
Wow. So again, close, but it passed. It really underscores how these seemingly administrative issues can get caught up in much bigger, deeply divisive political fights, especially around immigration.
Absolutely. And that wasn't the only SBA fight that day. There was another bill, H.R. 2987, known as the CEASE Act.
Tease Act. Okay, what was the goal there?
This one was about reversing changes made by the previous administration related to small business lending companies, or SBLCs. These are, non-bank lenders that work with the SBA loan program.
Non-bank lenders, right. So what did the CEASE Act want to do with them?
It aimed to bring back a cap on how many SBLCs could participate, and also to tighten the lending standards they had to follow.
Okay. And the argument for doing that, why tighten up?
Supporters argued it was about oversight, making sure the SBA could properly monitor these non-bank lenders. They also talked about keeping the main 7A loan program zero subsidy, meaning ideally it costs taxpayers nothing.
Okay.
And they brought up the PPP program from the pandemic as an example, suggesting there were potential fraud risks with some types of lenders. So tightening standards was framed as protecting the program and maybe favoring, more traditional federally regulated lenders like community banks.
Makes sense. And the pushback, why not tighten the standards?
The concern from opponents was about access to capital. They argue that capping SBLCs and making the rules stricter could really hurt, quote, unbanked small business borrowers operating in underserved markets.
So the idea is that these SBLCs might be reaching businesses that traditional banks don't.
That was the core argument, yeah, that these lenders fill a crucial gap, especially in communities that have historically had less access to funding.
So another SBA bill, but this time the tension is between, tighter regulation and established players versus broader access, maybe through newer or different kinds of lenders?
Exactly. Different philosophies about how best to manage the program and who it should prioritize serving.
And I assume there was a motion to recommit here, too.
There was, yeah. This one was from Ms. Velasquez of New York. Her motion also aimed to send H.R. 2987 back with instructions.
What were her instructions?
Hers included an amendment to specifically exempt a certain type of SBLC community advantage lenders, which are focused on those underserved markets from the new requirements.
Okay, so directly trying to carve out protection for those lenders serving vulnerable communities.
Right. And she also wanted to add an effective date tied to the SBA, certifying that the bill wouldn't lead to a decrease in loans to those unbanked borrowers in underserved areas.
Basically saying, prove it won't hurt these groups before it takes effect. Clever. And how did that motion fare?
That one failed, too. The record doesn't give the specific vote count in the section we have, but it indicates the motion was not agreed to.
Okay. So, both SBA bills moved forward despite these attempts to amend or delay them. It really paints a picture of these ongoing tensions. Oversight versus access, federal rules versus local impact, and how those play out even within one agency like the SBA. Were there other notable pieces of legislation mentioned for June 5th?
Yeah, the record definitely shows the wide range of things Congress deals with. There were brief mentions of other bills introduced or discussed, things like potential gasoline tax holiday. That was H.R. 3768.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and a bill about FCC licenses for companies making certain types of communications gear. That was S. 1962, coming from the Senate side.
Yeah.
And even one, H.R. 3776, that aimed to restrict the president from filing civil lawsuits. So, yeah, a real mix.
It's a good reminder of the sheer volume and variety of issues flowing through Congress every day. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Beyond specific bills, the record for June 5th also touched on some broader contextual issues, right? Concerns about the federal workforce and maybe some external influences.
Yes, this was quite striking. There was significant concern voiced about large-scale federal employee layoffs and buyouts. The numbers mentioned were pretty stark. Over 58,000 civil servants reportedly already laid off.
58,000, wow.
Yeah, and plans allegedly in place to cut another 150,000 jobs, plus 76,000 buyouts accepted. Big numbers.
Which agencies were cited as being hit hardest?
Several key ones. The CDC, Social Security Administration, SSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration, and NSA, and the FDA.
And what were the alleged consequences of these cuts?
Things you might expect, really. Delays in services like getting Social Security benefits processed. And hurdles for industries that rely on these agencies, like life sciences companies, apparently having trouble connecting with the right people at the FDA for regulatory approvals.
And this discussion also got into some more, let's say, controversial territory regarding outside influence. You mentioned Elon Musk.
Right. The record includes allegations connecting these workforce changes to potential external influence, specifically mentioning DOGE, likely a reference to Dogecoin and Elon Musk.
Okay, how so?
Well, the concerns raised, as presented in the record, involve the potential use of Musk's AI chatbot, Grok, within federal agencies. There were worries about Grok being trained on non-public government data, maybe seeking access to sensitive info,
Uh-huh.
and potential violations of privacy laws, like the Privacy Act of 1974. Cybersecurity risks were also flagged, the fear being these moves could expose sensitive U.S. data.
That sounds significant. And why was Congress suddenly focusing on this, according to the record? Was there a specific trigger mentioned?
Interestingly, yes. The source material suggests that a recent, very public spat between Elon Musk and Donald Trump might have been the catalyst. It implies that this political falling out could be why some members were suddenly pushing for oversight on these tech integration and workforce issues now.
So, personal political drama, potentially driving scrutiny of major government operations and tech policy. That adds a fascinating, if perhaps slightly worrying, layer.
It definitely shows how different spheres, politics, tech, government administration can intersect in unexpected ways.
Okay, another major theme that day seems to have been a big spending and tax bill. It was referred to, at least by supporters, as the Big Beautiful Bill.
Yes, that phrase definitely popped up. This bill was clearly a major focus and a huge point of contention. Proponents described it very positively.
How so? What were the selling points?
They highlighted things like major tax cuts, big investments in border security, mentioning the wall, technology, detention facilities, plus support for agriculture, expanding the exemption for the estate tax or death tax, and funding for the FAA. Their framing was that it would, strengthen the safety net while being fiscally sound.
Okay, that's the pro case. But the opposition, they painted a very different picture, didn't they, using CBO numbers?
Oh, absolutely. Starkly different. Opponents cited figures from the Congressional Budget Office, that's the nonpartisan scorekeeper, claiming the bill would cause 16 million people to lose health coverage.
16 million, mainly through Medicaid and the ACA.
That's what they claimed, yeah. And also that 11 million would lose food assistance. They accused the bill of making deep cuts to places like the National Institutes of Health, NIH, public broadcasting.
I think I saw mentions of Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Exactly, those came up. Plus, cuts to emergency food aid and worries about potential hits to Medicare funding as well.
And they didn't hold back with rhetoric, using quotes attributed to the bill's supporters.
No, they didn't. The record includes quotes opponents use, like, "We're all going to die, and I'm not worried about people losing their health care." They use these to paint the bill as, quote, callous, clueless, and careless.
Wow, strong words. What about the fiscal impact? Debt concerns.
Huge concerns from opponents. They argued, based on that CBO scoring, that the bill would add something like $2.4 trillion to the national debt.
Trillion with a T.
Yeah, and they also flagged a specific provision they saw as really problematic, something they claimed would limit judges' ability to hold government officials in contempt of court. They framed that as basically codifying attacks on the judicial branch and the rule of law.
So, just diametrically opposed views on the same legislation. One side sees tax cuts and border security. The other sees massive cuts to social programs, soaring debt, and an attack on the courts. It really encapsulates the fundamental ideological battles over government's role, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, and clearly these are fights that are far from over.
Okay, let's shift focus again. June 5th also involved discussions about America's role in the world. Foreign policy and defense came up quite a bit.
It did, and the timing was significant, as you noted earlier. The
Yeah.
81st anniversary of D-Day was approaching June 6th, which provided a sort of historical backdrop for talks about supporting allies, particularly Ukraine.
Was there specific action related to Ukraine?
Well, a Senate resolution was highlighted in the discussions. It strongly condemned Russia's ongoing aerial attacks on Ukraine. It got specific, mentioning the use of advanced ballistic missiles, including North Korean KN-23s that Russia apparently started getting in the fall of 2024.
North Korean missiles used against Ukraine.
Yeah. And the resolution detailed the devastating impact, pointing out that over half of Ukraine's power generation capacity had been destroyed by these attacks on civilian infrastructure.
So what did the resolution call for?
It urged the U.S. president to act quickly, specifically to approve requests from allies who want to send their own U.S.-made air defense systems. Patriot systems were mentioned by name to Ukraine, and of course to keep up security aid, training, and intelligence sharing.
So a push for more air defense and continued support. Was there criticism of current policy or statements?
Yes, the record noted criticism directed at President Trump's stated position about letting Ukraine and Russia, quote, fight for a while. The argument made against that was that Ukraine simply doesn't have the luxury of time.
Beyond Ukraine, did the record give glimpses into other global engagements? You mentioned a congressional trip.
Right. Members reported back from a trip to the Middle East, painting a picture of a really complex region.
What were some takeaways?
Observations like Iraq making efforts on the economic front, but still being, quite close to Iran. One member even mentioned seeing a prominent depiction of Qasem Soleimani.
Interesting detail.
Yeah. Kurdistan was seen as very pro-U.S., pro-commerce. Jordan was highlighted as a stable partner working for regional peace, though facing big challenges like water scarcity. And Israel, well, described as dealing with the multi-front conflict, the ongoing hostage crisis in Gaza, and trying out a new strategy for getting aid delivered.
So a lot of moving parts. And were there specific defense deals mentioned?
Just brief mentions of proposed sales, signaling ongoing relationships. Javelin anti-tank missiles for Estonia, about $296 million worth. And defense services for Kuwait, around $325 million.
Okay. What about broader defense strategy debates?
There was discussion reflecting that classic peace through strength viewpoint, arguing the U.S. needed to reverse military underinvestment, focus hard on next-gen weapons.
Like what?
Things like drones, AI, counter-drone tech, cheaper munitions, and also rebuilding infrastructure in the Pacific, specifically framed in the context of, China potentially outpacing the U.S. militarily.
And then there was that slightly unexpected debate about naming Navy ships.
Yeah, that was interesting. A Senate resolution came up supporting the decision to name ships after civil rights leaders. The USS John Lewis and the future USS Thurgood Marshall were the examples. The resolution called it a fitting tribute and argued against changing those names.
But there was pushback.
There was. It was contrasted with the Department of Defense statement suggesting ship names maybe ought to align more with the, quote, warrior ethos. And Senator Budd specifically objected to the resolution, citing naval tradition and the importance of getting input from sailors and shipbuilders.
So a debate about symbolism, tradition, and how the military represents its values. Fascinating how varied the topics can be.
It really is.
And alongside these huge debates on spending, foreign policy, and defense, the record for June 5th also captures moments that feel much more local, connecting Congress back to individual communities and concerns.
Totally. It's easy to forget that amidst the big picture stuff, members are also representing specific people and places. You saw things like acknowledging ALS Awareness Month, updates on judicial nominations, one confirmed, motions on others.
And lots of recognizing local folks, right?
Yeah, quite a few examples. Members highlighting students who got perfect ACT scores back in their district, honoring people like Bob Slaughter, who founded the National D-Day Memorial, congratulating fire chiefs or ministry leaders on reaching service milestones. Even things like a library director getting a Lifetime Achievement Award.
It grounds the proceedings a bit. What about institutional milestones?
Those too. Mention of Brantford High School's centennial, the 75th anniversary of the Manchester VA Medical Center, and achievements at the University of Iowa's Ophthalmology Department, including their work using AI and medicine.
Were tougher social issues also discussed?
Yes. The issue of gun violence was raised, with mentions of victims like Megan Kellerman. And you saw that contrasting perspectives clearly laid out arguments about Second Amendment rights versus concerns about the effects of permitless carry laws.
What about housing?
There was discussion around the low-income housing tax credit program. Some criticism surfaced about developers potentially making too much profit, questions about the program's cost when the government is borrowing heavily, and hints of concern about political favoritism in who gets the credits.
And any other sort of specific, maybe controversial points raised?
A few stood out. One member spoke against visa cancellations for some Mexican musicians, framing it as a kind of targeted cultural attack. Concerns were voiced about Chinese nationals arrested for allegedly trying to smuggle agricultural pathogens into the U.S.
Wow.
And there was even a specific call for the resignation of the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., citing issues around vaccine policy and the use of AI in health systems. So yeah, the range is just immense.
It really is. So looking back at this one day, June 5th, 2025, what does this snapshot suggest about where Congress might be headed? What are the implications?
Well, the intensity around those SBA bills, especially H.R. 2931 and the sanctuary city angle, it strongly signals that immigration is going to remain a huge flashpoint.
Yeah.
And it's going to keep bleeding into debates about totally different areas of government.
Right. Those fundamental disagreements clearly aren't going away.
Not at all. And the massive divide over that big, beautiful bill proponents versus opponents, it just highlights the ongoing deep-seated battles over spending, taxes, the size of government, social safety nets. Expect more huge fights framed by these clashing economic and social visions.
And internationally.
The focus on Ukraine, the specific calls for air defense systems combined with the Middle East trip report and the defense modernization talk,
Yeah.
it points to continued deep U.S. involvement in global hotspots and that strategic competition, especially with China, remaining front and center. These aren't just debates, they involve real dollars, real weapons, real alliances.
And the workforce and AI stuff.
That's potentially huge, too. The concerns about federal job cuts, agency capacity, and integrating AI, especially tied to privacy, security, and even, as we saw, political rivalries, could signal really significant changes in how the government actually works day to day. And it definitely signals new areas where Congress feels it needs to step up oversight.
So pulling it all together, this one day really shows that Congress is juggling an incredible amount. It's not just one big issue, it's global strategy, yes, but also the nitty-gritty of business loans, federal staffing levels, naming ships, honoring local heroes.
Exactly. It demonstrates how national policy intersects with almost everything, right down to your local community.
Which brings us to the listener. What does all this mean for you? Well, it means these debates and actions, even from one day, are shaping policies that can affect your healthcare, your job, your community resources, the economy, America's standing.
Right. And being informed isn't just academic. It's about understanding the forces shaping your world. The good news is you can dig deeper yourself. The sorts we use, the Congressional Record, it's public.
Where can people find it and the bills discussed?
The best place to start is congress.gov. That's the official site for U.S. federal legislative information. You can search for bills like H.R. 2931 or H.R. 2987, read the actual text, see who sponsored them, track their status.
And you can also use congress.gov or just your representative's own official website to find out who represents you and, crucially, how to contact them if you have views on these issues.
Absolutely. And committee websites are useful too. If you're interested in, say, small business issues, check the House or Senate Small Business Committee sites. They'll list upcoming hearings, markups. You can often even watch hearings live or recorded.
It's all part of staying informed and participating, right? It goes beyond just voting. It's about understanding the process and making your voice heard on the specific things being debated now.
Definitely. So maybe a final thought to leave you with. Think about that incredible range of issues we saw crammed into just one day, from global conflicts and massive budget fights down to local recognitions and technical debates. What does that sheer diversity tell us about the competing priorities and pressures that are constantly shaping our national policy?